Hello there. This is Reading with Steven. I'm Steven, and this is the next video in my continuing journey to read all of the books that I own, which is more than just this bookshelf. It is 4 other bookshelves worth of books that I have purchased but haven't read, or, well, not read all of them. Many of them I have read. But the goal is to read books and to talk about books, and hopefully that's something that interests you because you're here. Today, we're talking about the collected fictions of Jorge Luis Borges, the famous Argentinian author, academic, philosopher, I guess. He talks a lot about philosophy. In fact, much of what he does is, I think, in the realm of speculative fiction. But we'll get to that in a second. Borges, popular amongst the arch-villain of the literary world, the lit bro. Why they're the arch-villain, I've never been able to understand. For those of you who don't know, a man generally in his early 20s or 30s who reads David Foster Wallace and Thomas Pynchon and such manly books, if you will, to the exclusion of everything else, especially womanly books like Austen or the Bronte sisters. Obviously, we don't fall into that category here because we read everything. But think Jess from Gilmore Girls, if you will. You know, kind of a bad boy. Somebody who thinks of themselves as intellectually superior because of the books they read. But just like Jess from Gilmore Girls, I've always been of the impression that they are fictional. I've never met a lit bro in real life. I've never seen a lit bro online. Although I'm sure they do exist online, no doubt. But we're talking about Borges. We will be talking about Borges, who is more of a philosophical writer than a story-driven writer. Many of his short stories are, I think, good examples, or good would be good précis for a story, if you will, and not very good stories in and of themselves. Because Borges spends a lot of time thinking about, like, what if this were true? And then describing, like, a scenario. Rather than really digging in and having characters that experience the scenario, he just describes the scenario and just says, now you think about it. It's very, it's like a pared down version of The Twilight Zone, if you will. But that's what we're going to be talking about. But first, I think we should talk about what kind of author or what kind of books. Because we have a long string of books ahead of us that deal in speculative fiction. And I thought it'd be interesting if we talked about what exactly speculative fiction is first before continuing, because we're going to be dealing with it a lot. All right, before we continue with Borges, I do need to say, I don't need to say, but I am going to say, please, I do these videos because I love talking about books. I appreciate you guys watching the videos. If you could like and subscribe and leave comments about the books. The comments are the really important thing because I like talking about books, and I like it when people leave comments because I like talking about books. And if nobody comments, then it's not really a dialogue. It's just me ranting into the ether. And I'm more than happy to rant into the ether, but it's even better if there's a dialogue because again, I made this channel because I like talking about books and I want to talk about books with you. I appreciate it when you do that. So thank you again. Well, thank you for the first time, I guess. But if you like and subscribe and comment and all that jazz, then I really appreciate it because I like talking about books with you guys. So as I said, what is speculative fiction? Now, obviously, when we have a new literary term on this channel, for those of you who are aware, those of you who aren't aware, we go to our very handy dictionary of literary terms and literary theory, and we look up the word. Except the problem is there is no discussion on what is speculative fiction. There's no there's no article on speculative fiction, so we can't do that. So I had to go through all of the trouble of actually looking up what speculative fiction is. And it turns out nobody knows. Nobody knows what speculative fiction is. At best, probably the best definition I could find is that speculative fiction is science fiction and fantasy, but slightly more realistic than that. Than, like, who is it? Margaret Atwood says that it's science fiction without the aliens, right? So it's more than realism. It's less real than realism, but more real than just like a fable, a Grimm's fairy tale. So somewhere in between that. That is useless. But I do think that it points to the idea that speculative fiction ought to be speculative about real life. It shouldn't be so divorced from reality that it's obviously not applicable. The lessons that we learn from it are inapplicable to our real life as readers, but it need not be held back by, science, or rather by real life science. We can talk about space and the effects of space on people without necessarily being able to go into the far reaches of space, right? Actually, Margaret Atwood is a fantastic example of this. Margaret Atwood often uses speculative fiction, The Handmaid's Tale, which we didn't talk about because I only read half of it because my copy of it got destroyed mid-reading. It's kind of ironic, but it talks about, like, this could happen. The things in A Handmaid's Tale could theoretically happen. It's not impossible to happen, even if it hasn't actually happened, if you will. Borges, I think, very similar. He's more on the fantastical side of the speculative fiction, but he is very much writing things which could theoretically happen, or if they did happen, we can understand them from a very reasonable and rational point of view. His most famous work is The Library of Babel, for example. Now, The Library of Babel obviously is impossible. Sorry, let me discuss what the Library of Babel is first, shall I? So the Library of Babel discusses a scenario in which there is a theoretical library, and the library is infinite. It contains every book that could ever be written. Ever. This includes Shakespeare, and this also includes a random assortment of letters and numbers in a random order. Every book that could be written and printed is put in the Library of Babel for infinity. It is infinitely down, it is infinitely up, it is infinitely left and right. And that's the scenario. There's really not much more. There's not much of a story to that short story. It's just the scenario. For more of a story, you can look at Stephen Peck's A Short Stay in Hell, which is, I think, a more interesting thing in that it is an actual story with an actual character who is dealing with infinity, as opposed to Borges's. Again, much of Borges's, especially his early writing, is really just, here's a cool scenario. Think about it. It's the literary equivalent of, wouldn't it be wild if, and then there's nothing else. Now, that's very interesting. I think a lot of his stories are thought-provoking, but they're not very literary, if you will. Which is fine. It is what it is. But I don't really want to talk about the Library of Babel, because I don't think the Library of Babel... Well, there's a lot of videos about the Library of Babel. I think we should talk about some of his less well-known stories. And mind you, when I say less well-known, I don't mean less well-known amongst Borges fans. there are no doubt many people who would sit there and say, oh, but Stephen, these stories you chose, everybody knows those. No, they don't. Most people don't know them. Most people have never read Borges, period. But if they have read Borges, they've only read, like, The Library of Babel and maybe Tlon Uqbar Orbis Tertius. Maybe. No. But I want to talk about one of his earlier short stories from his collection called The Aleph from 1949. Yes. And it's the first story called The Immortal. So, The Immortal is about a Roman soldier who finds out about a river that can give you immortality. And he goes on a journey to find this river that gives you immortality. He goes through a lot of hardships. It's very hard. He almost dies. But finally, he comes to a city. Outside of the city are a bunch of, he refers to them as troglodytes, but they are kind of like demi-human. But eventually, the unnamed narrator comes to the city. He meets the troglodytes. The troglodytes are barely functioning. They sit around all day drinking muddy water out of this muddy stream in front of the city, and they eat lizards. Eventually, the narrator is able to get into the city itself and finds that it is empty. The city that he is fairly sure is the city of the immortals is empty. There's nothing there. In fact, the city is so empty that it's practically falling apart. So in disappointment, he walks outside and he notices it starts raining, and the troglodytes all come out of their caves and they stare up at the rain. And one of the demi-humans begins to speak Greek to him. Because it turns out that these troglodytes, these demi-humans, are actually the immortals themselves. Because the river that the narrator has been drinking out of this whole time with the demi-humans is the river of immortality. And the specific troglodyte that he speaks to is Homer of Iliad and Odyssey fame. Eventually, after talking with Homer, the narrator then goes home. And he realizes over time that actually being immortal kind of sucks. And he goes out of his way to find a river which will undo his immortality and kills him. Which he succeeds at. So, I guess good for him. What's interesting about this story is the way it talks about immortality, the way it talks about infinity. So, in the Library of Babel, it talks about how infinity is so impossible for people to understand and to contemplate that they kind of go crazy, right? They just make up things, and some people just jump off the library and kill themselves. Some people create cults. Some people just start burning books. Some people take it the idea of living very seriously. But there's no real rhyme or reason, because the immortality itself the infinity itself is so beyond human comprehension that they can't deal with it directly. And it's the same thing in The Immortal. Immortality is simply beyond human understanding. Homer gives a little speech about immortality in which he says, quote, "There is nothing very remarkable about being immortal. With the exception of mankind, all creatures are immortal, for they know nothing of death. What is divine, terrible, and incomprehensible is to know oneself immortal. Death, or reference to death, makes men precious and pathetic. Their ghostliness is touching. Any act they perform may be their last. There is no face that is not on the verge of blurring and fading away like the faces in a dream. Everything in the world of immortals has value of the irrecoverable and contingent. Among the immortals, on the other hand, every act, every thought, is the echo of others that preceded it in the past, with no visible beginning, and the faithful presage of others that will repeat it in the future ad vertiginam. There is nothing that is not as though lost between indefatigable warriors. Nothing can occur but once. Nothing is preciously in peril of being lost." So that was slightly long, but it boils down to the fact that immortality means that nothing matters. Literally nothing matters. It doesn't matter. You don't matter. Your family doesn't matter. Your friends don't matter. It doesn't matter. Nothing affects you. Even the idea of pain doesn't matter, because you might be in pain one moment, but eventually you won't be in pain. You might have pleasure one moment, but the pleasure will end and it will come back, and it will end and it will come back, so on and so forth, forever. And this means that in Borges' understanding, immortality levels everything off. Everything eventually stops meaning anything. I think this is wrong. I think this is a misunderstanding of human nature. But we're going to continue that misunderstanding of human nature. Borges is a very intellectualized writer. He seems to think in terms of the infinite and the immortal, in such a way that theoretically nothing matters. It's a very nihilistic view. We talked about nihilism in my video on The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, specifically the last book in the Hitchhiker's Guide series, because the first few books actually have a very existentialist view, that you make your own meaning in life, and that a truly enlightened person doesn't need an outside stimulus to do something, right? As Nietzsche says, the Untermensch is not some strong man. It is somebody who is self-actualized in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of way. Somebody who doesn't need for anything, not because nothing matters, but because they know that what matters is what they think matters. Borges, on the other hand, takes a very nihilistic view that nothing matters, therefore nothing matters. And that the only reason we think things matter is because eventually we're going to die. And that in dying, everything becomes immediate. We have to do things right now. It has to be done immediately. We have to work. We have to love. We have to read all of our books. We have to read all of our books right now because we don't have time. But if we had an infinite amount of time, there would no longer be that desire to do things. I think this is incorrect, because I think that the nihilistic take in Borges and in the final book of the Hitchhikers series is a fundamental misunderstanding of why people do things. I don't think people do things because we have to, because we are worried that we're going to die and we're not going to have enough time to do things. I think we do things because we like doing things, right? Because most people don't think about that they're going to die. One of the big reasons that people have a midlife crisis is not because they've reached midlife and they're like, oh, I'm not happy. They reach midlife and they realize, oh my God, I'm going to die soon. I need to do something to help me feel better about that fact. So to a certain extent, that is similar to what Borges thinks. But my problem with Borges is that most people don't spend any amount of time thinking about their own immortality. They're not thinking, I need to do things right now because I'm going to die. They do things right now because they want to do things right now. Because they have that self-actualized desire to do something right now. They're not going to sit there and contemplate for, 7 months while a bird builds a nest on them. I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how people think. And this is going to continue on through Borges's other stories. Later on in his life, this idea of entropy, if you will. Entropy is the scientific thought about how energy is always dissipating. I'll put a little thing in the video describing entropy, because I can't do a very good because I'm not a scientist. I don't do a very good example of it, but it's basically that everything will just dissipate over time. Borges very worried about cultural entropy. He talks a lot about not just personal entropy, that it, like in The Immortal, where our lives just start meaning nothing over time. But he's worried about cultural entropy too, where all human creation stops meaning anything over a long enough period of time. So we go to his much later short story, which is in the collection, yes, The Book of Sand from 1975. So, was it 20 some odd years, 30 years later, after The Immortal, we get A Weary Man's Utopia. So, when A Weary Man's Utopia is about a man who travels into the far future and meets like thousands and thousands of years into the future and meets a future human who is referred to as the host. And the man, the stand-in for the reader, if you will, is talking to the host about the host's life and how everything just seems kind of empty. And the host nods his head and says, quote, "When the individual has reached 100 years of age, he is able to do without love and friendship. Illness and inadvertent death are not things to be feared. He practices one of the arts, or philosophy, or mathematics, or plays a game of one-handed chess. When he wishes, he kills himself. When a man is the master of his own life, he is also the master of his death." The man is shocked at this kind of, again, nihilistic worldview, and the host says, "It is not advisable that the human race be too much encouraged. There are those who think that awareness of the universe is a faculty that comes from the deity, yet no one knows for a certainty whether this deity exists. I believe that what is being discussed now is the advantages and disadvantages of the gradual or simultaneous suicide of every person on the earth." And indeed, the story ends with the host going into what is effectively a death camp, specified specifically with the creator being Adolf Hitler, who invents ovens, I guess. It's fucked. It's kind of fucked. But the idea of people just kind of like, it doesn't matter. We're going to die. Nothing matters. The idea of an infinitely long time eventually going, who cares? It doesn't matter. The host at one point is talking to other future humans, and they mention his son, and he says, "I hope he has a good time of things," right before killing himself. It's just, I just cannot get over the idea that Borges has fundamentally misunderstood how humans actually think and act. Borges seems to think that we are automatons who over time will get more and more perfect to the point that we just stop caring. And I don't think that's ever true. I don't think people ever stop caring. It doesn't matter how old you are, how intellectual you are, how many things you do. You don't just stop. But we see this idea in a few of his other stories. He has two stories in particular in which a young Borges meets an old Borges. Borges, just so we're clear, very often is the main character in a lot of these stories. Well, it's a fictionalized version of himself. It's not himself specifically. But in both of those stories, yes, August 25th. The last one is August 25th, 1983. And it talks about a fictionalized older Borges killing himself and a younger Borges not being confused as to why the old Borges would want to commit suicide. And the young Borges saying, "Well, I don't think I'm going to do that." And the old Borges saying, "Well, you will when you get to my age." And it's just such a weird thing. Borges, obsessed with death and entropy, right, is a very entropic idea that people just eventually say, I don't care anymore. Who thinks like that? It's very much an idea of haha, guys, aren't we all thinking about killing themselves? Only for everyone to say, no, no, we're not thinking about that. That's an unhealthy way of thinking. You need help. Borges needs help. But that's my own personal ideas, I suppose. Obviously, I didn't read his nonfiction, his essays, and whatnot, so I can't speak to the Borges specifically, but I can say that there is this through line throughout all of his short stories of nothing matters. Oh well. It's very Eeyore-like, and I can't say that I cared for it. Overall, I can't say that I cared for Borges. His early stories are very, very intellectual and don't have much in the way of stories per se. And his later stories, once he starts adding characters, get depressing, get very depressing as he gets older. And they're very much about forgetting things, wanting to die, that sort of thing. And I don't vibe with it. I don't vibe with it. Such is the way of things, I suppose. Okay, so before we finish, I feel like I spent a lot of time talking about what Borges thinks and what Borges says and all that jazz. And that got me thinking about how relatively recently online I've been seeing a lot of people saying that, oh, just because an author writes something doesn't mean that they actually advocate for it. And I want to make it clear that that is true, but it's not always true. And I want to discuss how you know when something is true, or how you know when an author is talking about what the author themselves thinks, and how you can tell when an author is talking about something that they don't think. And it's very easy. The way to do that is, does the narrative support the argument that has been made? Because if yes, then it is because the author thinks it's a good idea. If no, it's because the author thinks it's a bad idea. It's very simple. Very easy to follow. It's a little tricky sometimes, I admit, but that's what it boils down to, is does the narrative support the opinion that has been laid out? So, for example, if we look at my least favorite book, Nemesis, The Goblin Emperor, which is up there and I can't grab it, but The Goblin Emperor supports a neoliberal monarchical worldview in which it's not the system that's the problem, it's the people in charge of the system. And if we change the people in charge of the system, then the system will work fine. This is something that is supported throughout the narrative, right? Maya comes in and he makes changes, and people like those changes, and everything works out. And therefore, the book itself supports the idea that we don't need systemic change, we need individual change. Now, regardless of whether or not you think that's a good thing, that is very clearly what Catherine Addison is getting at. Catherine Addison is a pseudonym. I don't remember the author's actual name, but it doesn't matter because we should use their pseudonym. It's the one they published under. Now, if we compare this to, or rather, another good example of this is, I don't have another good example of this. I had one in my head before I started ranting, and now I can't think of it. Oh, let's look at the books I have up there. I don't have a second example of a positive use of this, because I have completely blanked on every book I have ever read in my entire life in this exact moment. But for a negative example, if you will, a book that does not support the ideas of the main characters, we can look at Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. This is a very confusing book. A lot of people think that the portrayal of pedophilia means that Nabokov supports pedophilia, and because his main character Humbert is a pedophile. This is not true. From start to finish in that book, Humbert is described and characterized as a stupid lying son of a bitch. At no time does the narrative ever think that Humbert Humbert is anything less than that, or more than that, rather. So we can see that Nabokov, in making his main character a lying, horrible son of a bitch who advocates for pedophilia, we can see that Nabokov obviously does not support it. Because if Nabokov supported the idea of pedophilia, then the character wouldn't be a bad person who ends up dead at the end of the novel, right? He goes to prison and dies. That's not a character who does well. Maya in the Goblin Emperor, he does well. He's the emperor, everybody likes him. Therefore, his ideas are good. Humbert Humbert goes to prison, dies. Everybody hates him. Those ideas are not good. It's very simple. Now, obviously, those are just two very obvious examples. But that is true for all sorts of media. And so when thinking about media and whether or not the author supports an idea or doesn't support an idea, you need to look at who is putting forth the idea in the narrative, and whether those ideas are portrayed in a good light or a positive light, and those characters are portrayed in a good light and a positive light. I think recently I was seeing a lot of stuff about Mushoku Tensei, which is an anime. And in the anime, the character is again a pedophile. At no point is the character ever shown in a bad light for that tendency. Therefore, it's very obvious that the author is in favor of it. Because if the author wasn't in favor of it, they wouldn't be portraying it in a positive light, right? That's what you have to think about when reading. And these are the kinds of things that when people talk about literacy, that's the kind of skills that need to be developed by reading, and you understand them over time by reading more and thinking about the media that you consume. So, small rant over. Thank you for listening to me. Bringing it back to Borges. Small rant not over. So when I talk about Borges has this entropic view, it is because he has multiple stories over time in which this view is put forward. This is not just like a one-off, like, hey, wouldn't it be neat if? This is something that comes up again and again and again as themes to his books, or to his short stories. And that is how, regardless of what Borges might or might not have said in his nonfiction, in his essays, in his personal life, it doesn't really matter, because in his fiction, which is what we're reading, these are things that he says over and over and over and over and over again. And so we can take it to be like, yes, Borges has an entropic view. I remember my other thing in Charles Dickens, which I can read, Oliver Twist. That was a bookmark. Oliver Twist. Charles Dickens says that we should be nice to the poor people. All the people who are nice to poor people end up doing well. All of the people who are mean to poor people end up dying or in jail. Therefore, it is very obvious that Charles Dickens thinks that we should be nice to poor people. This is something that comes up throughout many Charles Dickens novels, though. It's not just in Oliver Twist, it is in all of his stories. So you can see that Charles Dickens, as a person, supports this idea. Or at least as an artist, supports this idea. People are complicated. They might support something theoretically, but not do it personally. But that's not the point. The point is, we're reading the book, so we're only reading what authors think or what authors are portraying in their novels, and how that affects whether or not we can understand the author, or whether or not we understand the author supporting or rejecting ideas. That is the point. Now the rant is over, that I have come up with all of my examples. So, in conclusion, I think Borges is definitely worth reading, but you probably don't need to read all of Borges. I don't Like there's a lot of duds. Not all of them could be David Pumpkin, if you will. But some of them are certainly interesting. Some of them are certainly worth reading because they are all very short. None of them are long. But I think you could definitely get by with an edited version of his books, or of his short stories. You know, a compilation of his best hits. I think would get you probably just as much benefit as reading all of them. There are a lot of duds. Especially the entire first work, A Universal History of Iniquity, absolutely not worth reading. I don't even know that it's worth the pages that it's printed on. It truly is bad. Fictions is interesting. All of them are interesting. Ironically, I think that The Maker from 1960, which is a collection of, it's like microfiction. Each one is less than a page long. Here, I'll show you. Like, we're looking at like this like maybe a couple paragraphs. It's microfiction and each one of them I think is really its best. It's some of his best stuff because it does what he seems really intent on doing, which is just creating a scenario and saying, "All right, we're done with that idea." It's just putting an idea on the page and then moving on without having to go through the trouble of exploring it fuller. Which is why when I talked about the Library of Babel, I mentioned A Short Stay in Hell, because I do think that a lot of Borges' short stories are interesting ideas, but I do think somebody needs to come along afterwards and really flesh them out for them to be more worth reading, if you will. Not that all the short stories are not worth reading. They are. I liked many of them. If you've been listening to my rambling thus far, I appreciate it. I thank you very much for watching the video. Our next video is actually gonna be, you know how in the beginning of the video I said that we should be reading books as opposed to buying books? I bought some books, and so we actually have to go back to the A's for Isaac Asimov because I wanted to read Isaac Asimov and I didn't own any, so I went back and I got some, and now I got to talk about them because I can't buy the books and not talk about the books, especially if we've already passed them in the alphabetical order. So we're gonna go back and we're gonna talk about Isaac Asimov, and I'm probably gonna do that in one video. So good luck to me. I don't have time. I do have time. I have time. We got time. We got nothing but time. As Borges would say, why worry about it? Life is life. Death is death. Doesn't matter. Nothing matters, according to Borges. But thank you. So the next video, Isaac Asimov. Thank you. I'm Steven, as I said before. I appreciate you guys listening, thinking, commenting, watching, liking, subscribing, all that jazz. I appreciate it. And go out. I kicked my camera. Go out, keep reading.